restart. Glad I remembered that. So my name is Helen Painter. I'm director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence. The Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence has two focuses of interest: interpretation of violence that the Bible contains, and studying the ways that the Bible is weaponized. And we do this in two different ways. We have a lively research community producing academic output in the form of papers and conferences and podcasts and lectures. And we've got a new peer-reviewed journal being launched very shortly, and we offer postgraduate study opportunities. But we also aim to support churches in understanding biblical violence and help them avoid using the Bible in ways that will harm people. We do this through accessible books and public lectures, Bible study material, public lectures like this one, Bible study materials, a preacher's blog, and a variety of online talks. So if you're interested in any of that, please do visit our website and have a look and see if there's anything there that might be of interest to you. That's csbvbristol.org. So this is the second of our Lent lectures. We haven't done Lent lectures before. This is a new venture for us. And very warm welcome to Georgina Jardim, who's agreed to give our second one. Absolutely delighted that she was able to do that, to agree to do that for us. Georgina is a fellow of the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies in Oxford, and she's lectured at various Christian and secular institutions on Islam's scriptural engagement, women and religion, and life and work in Muslim contexts. She's written on female characters in the Quran, a book entitled Recovering the Female Voice in Islamic Scripture, and a Grove booklet, which might be of particular interest to people attending tonight, called Storying Christian and Muslim Faith Together. Georgina's title tonight is Building Trust Through Interfaith Dialogue. And I think she's going to be asking the question, is interfaith dialogue just a public way to be nice to others, or could it be a way to learn more about ourselves and perhaps even about God? So I'm going to hand over to Georgina in just a moment or two. Those of you who were here last week will know that I set myself the challenge that we would begin each lecture with a prayer from a different Christian tradition. So it seemed very appropriate to have a prayer from the Orthodox tradition. I'm aware that there's more than one Orthodox tradition, but this is from one of those traditions. So perhaps you would join me in prayer. Let all believers turn aside from violence and do what makes for peace. By the strength of your powerful arm, save your people and your holy church from all evil oppression. Hear the supplications of all who call to you in sorrow and affliction, day and night, O merciful God. Let their lives not be lost, we pray you. Hear us and have mercy on us. But grant, O Lord, peace, love, and speedy reconciliation to your people whom you have redeemed with your precious blood. Make your presence known to those who have turned away from you and do not seek you, so that none of them may be lost, but all may be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth, so that everyone in true harmony and love, O long-suffering Lord, may praise your all-holy name. Amen. Over to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Helen. So I am going to share my screen and have a PowerPoint just for you to have something else to look at. I feel with these online presentations, it can become quite tiring to just focus on a screen, and especially just someone talking. So I'm just going to start by sketching perhaps the scene, and what I'll mostly be talking about is Christian-Muslim relations, although of course interfaith can include so much more. And one of the organizations that I'm involved in is the Oxford Interfaith Forum, that includes more than Christians and Muslims. And I'm very happy to see the founder of the Oxford Interfaith Forum with us here tonight, Dr. Thea Gomalauri, who is of Jewish background. But my presentation is going to be mostly about relationships between Christians and Muslims. So when it comes to interfaith relations, I suppose it's not unknown to say that it's perhaps a well-worn idea of the 21st century that peace seems elusive between the world's religions. Together with polarizing political discourses, we see rising tensions between worldviews represented by different identities and nationalisms. The charity Open Doors, which some of you might be familiar with, shows this most starkly in its World Watch list, which ranks the persecution of Christians in the world. And according to this list, the greatest sense of persecution is often in Muslim majority parts of the world. Here in the UK, discussion apparently flows in the other direction, with public accusations of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, sometimes anti-Christian bias, as shown as part of regular public debate. So while our local links might be different to these wider issues, and some of you may well have testimonies of good connections to share, relations between religions are generally taken to be distrustful, with expressions of fear on different sides, persistent isolation from each other, and growing misconception about the beliefs of others. Now, this is not only true of interfaith relations, but can be so in intra-faith relations as well. Some of you may know about the suicide attack on a mosque in Pakistan last week that killed more than 64 people, which was an attack on a Shia Muslim mosque by another division of Islam. And some are even saying that the Russia-Ukraine conflict has religious ideology at its heart. So mistrust, isolation, misconception, how do we overcome these and find peace in and through interfaith relations? I would like to suggest that there can be little change in the situation without trust. We might put good practices in place, we might reform the laws on our statute books, but without trust, these measures are not necessarily going to be long-lasting. Yet we may ask, what is the trust that leads to peace? What or who should we trust? And how do we build trust in relating to people of other faiths? So before looking at methods and case studies of interfaith dialogue, I would like to ask some questions to help us reflect on our own motivations for dialogue with others, so that we might be able to evaluate the things in which we place our trust to achieve peace. So the question is, what is the peace we seek to establish? Is it political peace that strives for absence of violence in a particular time and place? Is it existential peace that wants no confrontation nor challenge between the religions, but to just coexist in peace? Or is it perhaps a state of mind that remains constant, a trusting attitude that will gravitate towards the assurance that all shall be well and all manner of things be well? Is it perhaps a combination of all of these, all of the above, or none of the above, or one or two of these? Perhaps just I'll give you a couple of seconds or some seconds to think about that for yourself. Perhaps make a note of which ones you think are more important. So in thinking about these questions, I would like to start off with a biblical text. And it's a well-worn text, which some of you will immediately think of a song when you see the verse, which is Proverbs 3, verse 5 to 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. You might see there, Salem Baptist Church, it was our verse for the year last year, and we all had this card that we had put up on our fridges or mirrors as our verse for the year. So in light of this text, I want to pose a second set of questions that are more practically oriented, whether interfaith dialogue might help us trust in the Lord. So in the light of this verse that asks us to trust in the Lord, how might interfaith dialogue provide a mirror for us not to lean on our own understanding and to acknowledge him in all our ways, if at all? So when we reach out to others or when we're talking to others, where do we place our trust? Do we place it in intellectual knowledge of the Bible and Christian theology? Or perhaps in how much we know about the other faith and its theology? Or do we place our trust in the depth of our own personal spiritual practices and experience? Or perhaps in an appreciation of the differences between cultures and cultural difference as an enriching feature of social life. So with this in mind, I would like to tell you about some forms of interfaith engagement that I've been involved in and how I've come to experience these activities as trust building activities. I've been a student of Islam since my undergraduate days in South Africa. And as you heard, I've written on topics related to Islam. And I did this in response to a feeling of God calling me in this direction from early on in my life. However, I never really had a significant relationship with a Muslim, despite all my years learning about Islam. And I felt convicted to bring the Bible to bear on my scholarship. In blunt terms, I started asking myself, what is all this learning worth if it's not helping me connect with my neighbor and my fellow human beings? So inspired by some of the works that I was reading, for instance, the scriptural reasoning movement, and some Christian scholars, such as Dr. Ida Glaser, and you'll see some of the texts here, I sought connections with people who might share my heart. So it's a long story, and we might look into that a bit more in the question and answer time if you want. But suffice to say, in 2015, I established a local grassroots activity that we called the Holy Book Club. And the Holy Book Club was really a place for everyday Christians and Muslims to meet, reading the Bible and the Quran together, and getting to know each other and our faiths and our texts a little bit more. It wasn't an easy road, and we certainly weren't completely at peace. When we embarked on this road, we were full of worries and tensions on what this might bring about and what might happen. But we found a place. It was in the local Gloucester City Farm, which is run by a Muslim charity. And that little building you see there in the background was our first meeting place, where we met on a Saturday, and we read the text of the Queen of Sheba, Queen of Sheba's meeting with King Solomon from the Bible and the Quran. So the Quran has the same story, but with different emphasis, and or let's say it has the same characters, but the story runs in a different way in the Quran. So we met together, and we were all rather apprehensive, not sure what we were getting ourselves into. We were approximately, if I remember correctly, 6 Christian women and 6 Muslim women. I think we were equal numbers on that occasion. It wasn't always the case. But then we started going through the guidelines for our conversation. And we have 8 guidelines from the scriptural reasoning movement. And if you want to look at them, if you just Google scriptural reasoning, you'll come up with their website where they give you the guidelines and also some texts if you were interested in that. And I'll just highlight some of the guidelines. One is that we try not to generalize. So we try not to speak for all Christians and for all Muslims. We try and speak for ourselves as Christians and as Muslims. So we don't deny our identities, but at the same time, we also don't pretend that we can represent all Christian opinions. I'm not speaking for Roman Catholic Christians or Orthodox Christians, although I'm certainly speaking as a Christian, and likewise for my Muslim counterparts. And that immediately I could already see shoulders relaxing a little bit when we said that. We also said that we try and stick to the texts. So we don't have to feel that we represent everything that's happening on the outside world. Where it's relevant, of course, we talk about the things happening in the outside world, but we try to really talk about the texts of the Bible and the Quran in front of us, not about yesterday's headline news. And I can certainly testify to that rule. Our second meeting happened the day after the Bataclan attacks in France. So it was tested on numerous occasions. So those guidelines helped us to understand our role and what it was that we were coming together to do. And it removed a lot of the tension. So following on from that, we moved to different spaces and we looked at numerous topics over the next 2 years, anything from sin to olive oil, water, the sons of Abraham, trees. That just gives you a small taste of the various topics that we looked at. And all I'll say is I think some of the most profound conversations came out of the olive oil discussion. So this then went on not only to be about reading the text together or just meeting, but of course, sorry, as you could see from the previous one, we moved to a restaurant. So of course it started including eating as well and sharing meals. And eventually also moved into virtual spaces, WhatsApp groups, the ubiquitous WhatsApp group. Everyone needs a WhatsApp group where we would share activities, but also occasionally profound conversations. And one of the greatest treasures for me was the continuing conversation, which removed the pressure from that Saturday meeting, that I had to say everything and I had to get it right. And I couldn't follow up again. And if I didn't say it, then everything had gone wrong. We could follow up with each other as we were building relationships with each other. And as we were extending our activities, we could follow on from that conversation. And so I was free to say things like, I don't know, I'll have to go and look into that. Or let me get back to you on that. Or I've never thought about it in that way. I have to give this more thought to follow it up then either on WhatsApp or in further encounters. And so the reading, the conversation, the relationship all grew together in this way. And of course, started incorporating other events So during Ramadan, we would meet for meals or break iftar meals together, or at Easter time, we would have a community event, Christmas, of course, and also to include further activities, which was the Christian Arts Festival is something we do in Cheltenham that also brought an interfaith element into it. And so we started thinking about crafts that we can do together. And I would say this culminated really during lockdown, when we put together a craft that read the Bible and the Quran around a topic, and we met online while we were learning a craft activity. So it really brought all sorts of things together. The craft that we were doing was quilling. Some of you might know that. That's when you roll some paper around a toothpick and you stick it to a piece of paper, and you can make beautiful, some of the designs were just exquisite. And all of this while we were thinking around texts of women and water in the Bible and the Quran. A character like Hagar, or Hagar, who is so important to the Islamic tradition, and yet she does not feature in the Quran. Or the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. Those are the ones we immediately think of. But then I was very surprised to be reminded of Moses meeting his wife, Zipporah, at a well. How often do we hear a sermon preached on Moses's meeting with his wife at a well? And that is certainly a story that is shared between the Bible and the Quran. So these, all of these activities and these conversations, I would like to illustrate 3 ways in which I experienced these interfaith practices as developing trust. And that is really through three elements of trust. Trust as vulnerability, trust as rest, and trust as discipleship. Now, what do I mean with trust as vulnerability? Sorry, I think I skipped one. Sorry. Reading my Bible next to the Quran meant opening it and myself up to questions from others, having to answer to them and myself what I understand the text to mean and what I believe because of it. This is a vulnerable position to be in. Firstly, I may not be sure that I can give the right answer or a good answer. I may also be unsure whether I can ask my Muslim neighbor the right question. What if I don't know enough about Islam? What if I offend someone by the question that I ask or the comment that I make? Or conversely, what if the Quran speaks to me and I can't find a good biblical response? What if I find Muslim practice and faith compelling? What if it all goes wrong? These are the pressures we bring to the conversation, and they are real. These were certainly my worries before starting on this path. When it comes to my own faith life, being vulnerable in this way opened me up to prayer in a context where the stakes are high. I read God's word with the questions of another ringing in my ears. I'm therefore not only vulnerable in the face of my Muslim neighbor, but before God. So when I prayed, I envisaged these difficulties and expressed them in my requests for wisdom and guidance. Speaking for myself, engaging in this activity definitely rekindled my prayer life. So that brings me then to rest. Having brought these concerns and vulnerabilities before God, I then had the challenge of proceeding in faith. To some extent, this was the real test. Did I trust God to work? Are the words of the Bible sufficient? Are our prayerful attitudes and responses spirit-filled? And in this, I was challenged by fellow Christians and by texts such as Deuteronomy 4, verse 5 to 8, which I'll just read quickly here. See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near to them the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you today? Just as an aside, it's interesting to note that the greatness of the nation here is not in its military or political power, nor in the grandeur of its architecture and culture, nor in the numbers of its people or the nations that they've overcome. Instead, the greatness of the people here is in having the Lord our God near to us when we pray to him, and having decrees and laws that are righteous. That is rather poignant, I think, in our world today. In other words, I've prayerfully offered my engagement with others to the Lord. If I've asked for my testimony to be truthful, and I'm acknowledging that the Bible reflects the laws, the righteous laws and decrees of God, then I have to trust in God's faithful leading and for the Spirit's leading in my conversations. So if I've soaked my vulnerability in prayer, then my life of faith requires that I rest in God to do his work. And this understanding to rest in God was really confirmed to me most clearly in another parable. I don't think I didn't record that one on the PowerPoint, but in Mark 4, we have a parable in between the lamp and the mustard seed. There's a very short piece that says, Jesus also said, this is what the kingdom of God is like. A person scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, whether they sleep or get up, the seed sprouts and grows, though they do not know how. All by itself, the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. And this was the text for trusting as rest. The seed will grow, whether I sleep or get up. This is the promise of the Lord that I can trust and in which I rest. The practical part, of course, is that I sow. There can't be growth without the seeds. So next then, to trust as discipleship. And I have to say, this is something that I've just recently started reflecting on, and I'm still trying to articulate it for myself. So if this sounds a little bit jumbled, then my apologies. I'm still trying to make this out for myself as well. But this trust that I've just expressed, as I see it, is the foundation of discipleship. And here I take the literal meaning of disciple. In other words, someone who engages in learning from another, or one who associates and follows someone who has a reputation for knowledge. And this is a meaning that is attested not only in the Bible, but outside of the Bible, in the Greek world. Connecting with Muslims as people and reading the Bible together is as much a process of them learning about the Word of God as it is me understanding the gospel message anew. So digging through the various layers of culture that are at play when we read scriptures together, we inhabit each other's worlds as we inhabit the text. And if we just think about these different cultures, that layers of culture, firstly, there's the culture that I inhabit. For some of us, that might be a monoculture, but I think in our world today, our identities are multiple. But nevertheless, we have certain fixed ideas about life and faith that we bring to the conversation, whatever our cultural identity. Secondly, there's the culture of my interfaith interlocutor, be that Muslim or Jewish or someone of no faith, who bring their culture to the meeting. And their identities might equally be multivalent, but they certainly come from a particular cultural identity. And then thirdly, there are the cultures of the texts and the worldviews they display. And these may confirm or confront our assumptions about culture and what we think we believe. Though the boundaries and the essence of our identities may be contingent and contested, cultures provide the context in which religious texts are interpreted as women and men live out the daily implications of their faith and seek answers to life questions within it. So religious teachings can reinforce some cultural patterns, but be in tension with others, and testing them against the holy texts may show up even more tensions. One interesting aspect may be that the culture of my Muslim interlocutor is closer to the culture of the Bible than my own. This is certainly what I found in practices of reading the Bible and the Quran together. And in trying to explain that, I will illustrate it with two examples that I experienced in reading the Bible and the Quran together. The first one is about, I would say, my discipleship. And the second example is about my Muslim counterparts' discipleship. The first one was when we read the topic of forgiveness together from the texts of Leviticus and Luke and from the Quran's chapter 39. The Luke passage is Luke 6, verse 24 to 30, where Jesus is eating at the house of the Pharisee and a woman comes in to wash his feet with her tears. And the Pharisee thinks to himself that if Jesus only knew what woman this was, if he was a true prophet, he wouldn't allow Jesus wouldn't allow her to touch him. And then Jesus tells the parable of the debts that are to be excused, and ends with the question, which one would be the more grateful for having their debts forgiven, the one with lots of debt or the one with little debt? So because of my knowledge of apologetics in Muslim context and Christian theology, I assumed the significance of this text for my Muslim counterpart would be what the passage says about the status of the prophet. And so I wanted to understand what was distinctive about Christian and Muslim forgiveness. However, some way into the discussion on the Jesus parable, my Muslim counterpart started relaying an event in his life when he felt he had not dealt well with someone in need. He spoke about the guilt he felt and how much he feels in need of forgiveness. He concluded that he needed to find the person to make amends. It was a moment of vulnerability and openness where we could reflect together on the grace of God and how Jesus embodied it. And in that moment, it struck me that I felt like the Pharisee who had prejudged the conversation and what I thought would be significant for my Muslim friend, whereas he was in effect reenacting the story in the Bible. And it was a real teaching moment for me and in my discipleship. So a second example that I want to bring to you is from a Christian friend who was reading. This wasn't my own experience, it was a Christian friend experience who told me about it. When he read the story of Jesus healing the blind man in Mark 8, verse 23, the Gospel of Mark, where we have this extraordinary text that says Jesus spat onto the man's eyes. Now, our Bible translations try to, they would say spat and put it on his eyes, but most are convinced that the text says spat into his eyes, which is a story that certainly perplexes and for many of us even disgusts the modern Western reader. At the least, it's a bit embarrassing. However, this person told me that the Muslim immediately exclaimed that they now understood the purity of Jesus. When Christians spoke about the purity of Jesus, that text just immediately explained it to them. And now to understand what is behind the Muslim observation here is that they need to preserve their ritual purity for their 5 daily prayers. And so they have to do ritual cleansing every time that their purity is broken for the daily prayers. And this can happen from, there are all sorts of regulations that break your ritual purity, one of which is if someone spit, if you come into contact with someone's spittle. And so it was just extraordinary for this Muslim reading this to think about Jesus's spit, not only not making someone ritually unclean, but healing them. And so he just immediately grasped what Christians mean when they say Jesus is pure or holy. So I think these 2 examples perhaps illustrate much more what I want to say about discipleship, and I still have to go and figure out how to articulate it well. But I'll conclude by saying my sharing and telling of faith goes together with hearing questions and comment that help me to see the Bible in a new light. Of course, my interfaith partner may also start a journey in discipleship of the Bible. And in this way, I've come to trust these interfaith encounters as discipleship encounters, or more accurately, Emmaus Road encounters, where our hearts are left burning within us as the scriptures are opened up to us. And this to me has been a path of peace. Thank you for listening to that presentation, and I'll happily take any questions you might have or comment that you might have in the light of it.
Thank you so much, Georgina. That was just fantastic, and to hear stories interwoven with some of your wrestling was so enlightening. I really appreciated that. I'm wondering if people have got some questions immediately and would like to dive in. Otherwise, I've got something I might ask. As I was saying last week, I can't necessarily see you all at once, so if I don't spot a raised hand, then please shout out.
In the meantime, I can put into chat the website for scriptural reasoning. If people want to look at the guidelines and the text bundles that are available there,
that would be very
and
helpful.
there are all sorts of resources there.
One of my questions, perhaps while people are thinking, although I think you may have implied the answer to it in something you said later on, but you started off with a group of all women, I think, but it sounds like you've done it with mixed groups as well. Does it work? Are there particular dynamics that work better or worse with single-sex groups or mixed groups? Oh,
that's such a good question. We started with an all-women group because it was certainly our Muslim counterparts felt that they couldn't have mixed groups, and so it was really in a bid to accommodate their needs that they couldn't be in a mixed group. But of course, there's also the dynamic of people not necessarily wanting to speak up in front of each other in mixed gender situations. but then when we, so I would say that's in a local setup that is, it's not in an academic environment. It was, you know, we were housewives and teachers, and there was a policewoman. One of the Muslim women was a policewoman. So not necessarily people with an academic background, or they were certainly literate. They all had English education, and we could, yeah, I'm just thinking of something, you know, the different contexts in which we might be engaging with Muslims. There are some contexts where people are just recently arrived and perhaps are not quite fluent in English yet, or might not read English, where the activity might not progress that well. You certainly need to be able to read and be fluent in the same language. But then when we moved, so at the university, in the Students' Union, there were, it was mixed, male, female, and that was often more than just Christian and Muslim. So we would often have people of no faith, who didn't profess any faith, but were really interested to read the texts and hear what Christians and Muslims believe about the text. And of course also challenge us and take part in the conversation.
Anyone? I've got more questions, but is anybody else? Peter, you're mute at the moment.
Sorry. Georgina, thank you for such an interesting lecture. I was really latched onto what you said toward the end, because it has never really struck me that somebody from another religious tradition could help us understand the Bible more clearly. And I thought that was such an interesting example. And the sense that their culture may be closer to the culture of the Bible than ours is, which makes sense when you think about it, but it's just not something that I had thought about. I didn't know anything more you can say about that, but I just thought that was such a valuable insight, really. And great that we can learn about our own texts from another religion. I think that's such an important observation.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, because that has been the biggest learning curve for me. You know, where one initially might have engaged in this to say, I would like others to learn about the Bible, of course, which is part of what we want to do. And just to say, from perhaps a practical point of view, our Muslim friends often expressed that they want us to learn about the Quran. And at some stage, the conversations even moved towards, you know, as our relationships grew, we would say things like, I would love it if you would be in heaven with me one day. You know, so we put it on the table that, of course, we would like to persuade each other about the truth of our texts. But that is, you know, and once we put that on the table, in a sense, we could almost move on with the conversation. We understood that about each other. And so I want to be really clear that we were engaging within our identity, you know, within our faith identities. We weren't hiding anything. But then the learning that I experienced from the questions and comments from Muslim friends, you know, in a sense, I can't thank them enough for that. It really opened my eyes to the world of the text. If I can just mention another example, in that women's group, we read the story of Ruth together. And of course, there are some things that perplex us from the story of Ruth, you know, the whole idea of levirate marriage and all of these things. But the most interesting aspect for my Muslim friend was, my goodness, this mother-in-law and daughter-in-law have a good relationship. That is so extraordinary. And so that really drew them. And we just wanted to read the first chapter, because we were talking about vows and, you know, the vow that Ruth makes to her mother-in-law. But then they wanted to read the whole story, because it drew them, they found the narrative so compelling because of that.
One of the things that occurs to me is that those of us who've perhaps grown up with these texts or have been reading our Bibles for many years, they become so familiar, don't they? And one of the challenges that I think face us, those of us who preach, is how can I help my congregation to encounter this text as if for the first time, or with a freshness, to be surprised by it again. And I'm wondering if this does that sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. We read a text, and of course, just to say, it starts already when you're reading it in the presence of someone that doesn't believe this and is perhaps highly suspicious of your text. It already opens you up to, as I said, perhaps embarrassing features or things that you think might be offensive, or how am I going to explain this? And we get stuck perhaps on the theology of it, because for us it's so much about the nature of God and what does this say. And then as you can see from these things these examples, the question and the comment just comes from left field, where you think, I've never even noticed that, or I didn't think that's important at all. And yet it then becomes really important in that conversation. Or it's at least, in the very least, it opens up the conversation in a new way. And so that I can only affirm that I'm once again speaking for myself, that grew up in a missionary household. I've the Bible has been part of my life from day one. So exactly as you say, we can skip over the text so easily, because we want to get to the nub of the story. What's the moral here? And then we let go of those beautiful details.
Anyone else got a question or comment? Do you see any? Oh, sorry, was that a hand?
It was sort of, yes.
Yes, go ahead, Judy.
I do remember at one time trying to set up a group such as you discussed when I was chaplain at the university. We found it very difficult getting women together in such a way that it really worked. We had contacts with people. But I have spent a lot of time in ecumenical study groups, Bible study groups and Lent groups and whatever, and noting the large variety of people from Christian traditions, one Christian tradition that can get into quite a heated discussion about texts or culture or what you do in church. And clearly Muslims can do that as well. I wondered, within the groups that you had, did you notice tensions arising between the Christians group that you had in the Muslim group, or were they quite sort of monocultural?
Oh goodness, that's so. I can only affirm what you said in terms of the tensions that you get. The intra-faith tensions are more often there than interfaith. It might very well be because we're expecting it, and so we're more careful about it. We don't necessarily expect to be differing with each other, but then you might find that a fellow Christian makes some comment where you think, oh my goodness, that was very unhelpful, especially in that context, where it might be a kind of an internal debate that's not very helpful. So I definitely had a fair share of experiences with that. I'm trying to think, there was something really contentious in a group last year between the Christians. It's usually about the Trinity. But yeah, where Christians start either the Trinity or the creation account. I mean, that just sets the intra-faith debates around that are usually very contentious.
Yes, I used to have an Orthodox colleague. I love muttering the word filioque every now and then.
Yeah.
Very naughty.
And that's where, you know, the guidelines really help. And I make a point of repeating the 8 guidelines. They're on the Scriptural Reasoning website. As I say, I only highlighted one. They're really helpful to remind ourselves just what it is we're doing here. But that would be the same for on the Muslim side, you know, certainly the Sunni Shia division.
Yes.
Although here in Britain, of course, I think I've often thought that there is a space where they can actually talk here. You know, we provide the space for them to have some interfaith connection. But it does occasionally, although people are quite careful not, I think sometimes they don't want to display the differences between them too much. So I'm not sure that things always get said that they want to say.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
You mentioned, Georgina, that you were concerned. One of your fears at the beginning was that you wouldn't know enough about Islam to have these conversations well. But you obviously have quite a lot of experience and wisdom around that already. How important would you say it is to have a good grounding and a good understanding of Islam before you would embark on this kind of thing?
So this is one of those fish swimming in the water, trying to explain how cold water is. You know, I would like to say that you don't necessarily need a lot of information about Islam, simply because there's such a huge diversity when you connect to Muslims. So of course you can go and read lots of books about Islam, but then what you'll often find is when you then start engaging with Muslims, they'll come from a variety of traditions. You know, there are different legal schools that have different legal practices. They have different bodies of tradition that they often, their practices often, they will acknowledge this themselves. The traditions are often elevated above the Quran even. So I'm a Quran specialist. I know the Quran reasonably well, but I'm not well versed in the traditions at all. And you know, so that's what you'll then find when you start gathering several together, is this one practices, even prayer positions will differ within traditions. So it's good to inform yourself about some aspects of it. But there is something to be said for the openness, to be open, to really hear, to question, you know, to ask, how do you do that? And then to say, why do you do that? To really be open. I think sometimes if we have knowledge about it, we then make assumptions. I mean, I find myself often thinking, I've read differently to what you've just said to me. So that's not really helpful, is it? You know, there's something, I think it comes back to that vulnerability to say, I know nothing, tell me. You know, I've never read the Quran, I don't understand this. You know, that's what the space is there for. This, you know, we're creating this space. I want to say it's a safe space, but it's not a safe space in the sense that nobody will be challenged. It's a safe space where we can challenge each other. You know, where we can say, well, this is what I've read. Is this true? Or this is what I've seen. How do you feel about that? You know, as the relationships develop, of course, those aren't necessarily questions one asks on the first occasion. But as the relationship develops, you know, there's more of an openness, and you get the same. You get the same from them, where they will have certain assumptions about what they think Christians are like, or what Christians believe. And certainly, I think you might have come across this yourself, where they will assume that British culture is Christian culture.
Mhm.
And then when you say things like, well, I don't agree with that, and then they're rather surprised how is this not Christian? You know, how is this British aspect not Christian, or things like that.
Thank you.
I think we have, oh, what, there we are. I was just going to say one more question. Peter, you've nabbed it.
Recognizing the openness and the trust you've been able to build with your Muslim partners in the conversation, have you found that helped you with Christians from other traditions being able to sort of understand and get into their minds a bit better?
Oh, it's given me huge sympathy, because of course it holds up that mirror to oneself, isn't it? Where and I think we might be a little bit more intolerant of each other than we are of other faiths, you know. So I often, when we see how people respond, we think, oh goodness, I'm like that, or I used to be like that. And we learn some patience with each other, and at the same time also learning about other Christian traditions. So where I've participated with, I'm myself from the Protestant tradition. I'm Dutch Reformed from South Africa. That should give you some indication. And currently attend a Baptist church. But yeah, and then especially with Eastern Christians, so Egyptian and Middle Eastern Christians who sometimes also participate, who really culturally are closer to Muslims than they are to me. So yeah, all around, and not just learning about other faiths, but also about the history, the rich history of Christian life and traditions.
Well, thank you so much, Georgina. I've been wanting to learn more about scriptural reasoning myself for a long while, so that's been really helpful for me, and I'm sure for all of us. And yeah, it's so inspiring actually to hear of what you're doing, and yeah, just makes me want to go away and find a group and join it. So you've certainly inspired and encouraged me. Thank you. It's very hard on Zoom, but should we indicate our thanks to Georgina in the traditional way? We've concluded by speaking about ecumenicalism, and just to point out that there's 4 Lent lectures left in this series. At least one is explicitly speaking about ecumenical engagement. So you might want to have a look at what's coming up. Next week, I'm very pleased to say that Professor David Toombs is going to be speaking to us. David's in the audience today. David's Howard Patterson Chair, Professor of Theology and Public Issues at Aotearoa, I can never pronounce that, in the University of Otago, New Zealand. And David's title is Witnessing to Christ's Love in Reconciliation, Opportunities and Challenges for the Church. So please, if that interests you, please register for that in the same way as you did for this lecture, and your Zoom link will come through. David has suggested that for those who are going to be joining us, I'm just looking for the chat, which just appeared. Then you may, it's certainly not necessary, but you may like to do a little bit of background reading, and I'm going to put a link in the chat. So for those who might be interested, then do take a look at that in advance and pass the word on. Last week's lecture, for those who weren't with us, or if you've got someone you know who'd be interested, last week's lecture is currently on YouTube, and this week's will be going up there fairly shortly. So yes, please pass the word around, and let's share the blessing, because it's been such a yeah, so helpful. Let's shall we close together by saying the grace? Feel free to unmute if you'd like to, otherwise maybe say it's muted, but I actually love the kind of slightly haphazard chaos of us all saying it at once, unmuted. So let's say together, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God
And
and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much, and I hope to see you next week.